They smiled at her wedding. Every single one of them. Her father, her stepmother, the people who had spent years making her feel like she did not belong. They all smiled. The kind of smiles that look like celebration from the outside, but mean something else entirely from the inside. Her stepmother smiled because she had finally gotten what she wanted. Her father smiled because agreeing with Diane had become easier than seeing clearly. The guests smiled because that is what you do at a wedding, because nobody in that room understood what was actually happening, because weddings are the one occasion where a smile is expected regardless of what the truth is underneath it. They all smiled. And Sarah Carter stood at that altar in a white dress she had not chosen, beside a man she did not know, in a ceremony she had not asked for. And she kept her face composed and her back straight and her eyes forward. And she made herself a promise. She was not going to disappear. Not for any of them. Not today. Not ever. What none of them knew. Not her father. Not her stepmother. Not a single smiling person in that room. Was that the man standing beside her at that altar was about to change everything. Not in the way that wedding ceremonies are supposed to change things. Not in the language of vows and fresh starts, and two becoming one. In a deeper way than that. In the way that happens when two people who have both been hurt by the world find each other in the last place either of them expected and decide, slowly and without announcing it, to stop being afraid. That is what was about to happen. And Diane, who had arranged every detail of this moment, who had spent 3 years engineering this outcome, who stood in the second row in her deep burgundy dress feeling the clean satisfaction of a plan finally completed, had no idea. She thought she had won. She thought this was the end of Sarah's story in her house, in her family, in her life. She was not wrong about the ending. She was wrong about whose ending it was. Before we go any further into this story, we want to stop for just a moment and ask you something. If you are watching this right now, if something in these first few minutes has already touched something real in you, please let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. People from all over the world find their way to these stories, and every comment reminds us why we tell them. And please, if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We tell stories like this one every single week. Stories about real people, real choices, real consequences. And you do not want to miss what is coming. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to a yellow house on Maple Creek Road, and a little girl on a porch watching fireflies, and the life that Sarah Carter had before everything changed. Sarah Carter grew up in a small town in Tennessee, the kind of town where everybody knows your name and your parents' names and your grandparents' names, and where summer evenings smell like cut grass and fireflies come out just after dark in a way that seems almost too beautiful to be real. She grew up in a yellow house on Maple Creek Road with her mother, Ellen, and her father, Robert, and for the first 14 years of her life, that house was the safest place she knew. Ellen Carter was one of those rare women who carried warmth the way other people carry a coat, always ready to wrap it around someone who needed it. She laughed at things that other people let pass by. She made food from scratch because she said the love was in the making, not just the eating. She had a way of sitting with her daughter in the evenings on the front porch, the two of them watching the sky change color, that made Sarah feel like there was nowhere else on earth worth being. She was, by every account of anyone who ever knew her, the kind of person who made the world feel more generous just by being in it. Ellen got sick when Sarah was 14. It started quietly, the way those things often do, with tiredness that did not go away and a doctor's appointment that led to another doctor's appointment, and then a conversation at the kitchen table that changed the shape of everything. Sarah sat at that table and listened to her parents talk in the careful, measured voices of adults trying not to frighten a child, and she understood enough to know that the world had just shifted in a way it would not shift back. Ellen fought for 2 years. She was the kind of woman who fights not loudly but steadily, with the same warmth and humor and stubborn presence she brought to everything. She made Sarah promise, toward the end, to pay attention to the beautiful things, to not let grief close her off, to stay open, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Sarah held that promise like a stone in her pocket for years afterward. Sometimes it was a comfort. Sometimes it was the hardest thing she owned. Robert Carter fell apart slowly after Ellen died, not in a way he would have recognized or admitted to. He kept going to work. He kept the house clean and the bills paid and the lights on. He did all the functional things a father is supposed to do, and if you had asked his neighbors or his colleagues, they would have said he was holding up well, all things considered. But Sarah knew better. She was living inside the thing that his colleagues only saw the outside of, and what she saw was a man who had loved one person completely and did not know how to love anything fully anymore once that person was gone. He stopped sitting with her at dinner the way he used to. He stopped asking about her day in the way that meant he was actually listening for the answer. He was present in the technical sense and absent in the sense that mattered. And Sarah, who had promised her mother to stay open, found herself slowly and quietly learning to need less, to ask for less, to take up less space. Not because she was told to, because taking up less space felt safer than needing things that were not going to come. She was 17 when Diane arrived. Diane Holloway came through a mutual friend, introduced at a church barbecue on a July afternoon, and Robert Carter, who had been going through the motions of living for 2 years by then, looked at this composed and attentive woman and felt something stir in him that he had not felt in a long time. She was warm with him. She was interested in him in the specific, focused way that people who have decided they want something are always interested. She had 2 children of her own, Marcus, who was 15, and Leah, who was 13, and she spoke about them with a pride that Robert found easy to respect. She asked about Sarah. She said all the right things. She touched Robert's arm when she laughed. And Robert, who was lonely in a way that had become physical by then, a loneliness that lived in his chest and woke him up at 3 in the morning, let himself be found by her. He let himself be warmed. He did not look closely enough. He did not notice what Sarah noticed the very first time she met Diane at a dinner in their house, sitting across the table from her while her father laughed more than he had laughed in 2 years. He did not notice the way Diane looked at Sarah, the way you look at a thing that is standing between you and something you want. They dated for 1.5 years. Robert proposed on a Saturday in October, and Diane said yes with the composure of a woman who had been expecting it and had already decided what dress she would wear to the wedding. They were married the following spring, a small ceremony at the town hall with Sarah standing in a blue dress she had chosen herself, holding flowers, trying to be glad for her father's happiness and finding, underneath the effort, something quieter and colder than gladness. She told herself it was grief. She told herself it was the particular ache of watching your father choose a new life when the old one still felt unfinished. She told herself to give it time. She gave it time. And what time gave her back was not the warmth she had hoped for. It was a house that felt smaller every month. A dinner table where she was present but not quite included. A stepmother who was never unkind in any way that Sarah could prove, but who made her feel, in every room of the house they now shared, like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Marcus and Leah were not cruel to Sarah in a deliberate way. They were simply children who took their cues from their mother. And their mother's cues were clear even if they were never stated out loud. Sarah was separate. Sarah was background. Sarah's room was the room at the end of the hall that you walked past without stopping. Her things were the things in the kitchen that nobody moved, but nobody used either. She existed in the house the way a piece of furniture exists in a room, present but not considered, there but not seen. She started spending more time at the public library in town, where a woman named Mrs. Hendricks had known her mother and always had a paperback waiting on the counter when she came in and asked her real questions and listened to real answers. The library became the place where Sarah felt like herself. And herself, at 19 and then 20 and then 22, was a young woman who loved books and observed carefully and did not perform happiness she did not feel and was quietly, privately, deeply determined not to let the life being arranged around her become the life she actually lived. It took Diane approximately 2 years to understand that Sarah was not going to disappear on her own. She had hoped, at first, that the natural drift of young adulthood would do the work for her, that Sarah would go away to college, or move for a job, or fall in love with someone who lived somewhere else, and the house on Maple Creek Road would gradually, organically become Diane's in the way she needed it to be. Fully. Completely. Without the complication of Robert's daughter from his first marriage sitting at the kitchen table and carrying Ellen Carter in her face, and her mannerisms, and the particular way she held her coffee cup in both hands, which was exactly the way Ellen had held hers. Sarah's presence was a reminder, not of anything Diane had done wrong, exactly, just of the life Robert had before, the love he had before, the loss he still carried, and that Diane, for all her patience and all her warmth toward him, could not fully erase. Sarah was a living monument to a woman Diane could not compete with. And so Sarah had to go. She started slowly. The first year of the marriage, she focused entirely on Robert, on becoming indispensable to him, on weaving herself so thoroughly into the fabric of his daily life that the idea of her absence became genuinely unimaginable to him. She did this well. She was good at it. She has the kind of intelligence that is less interested in ideas than in people, in reading them, in understanding what they need and positioning herself as the person who provides it. Robert needed to feel like a good man. He needed to feel like his choices were reasonable and his instincts were sound, and that the grief he still carried was being handled with appropriate dignity. Diane gave him all of that. She reflected back to him a version of himself he found comfortable, and in doing so she made herself the lens through which he understood everything else, including his daughter. The campaign against Sarah was conducted in the language of concern. Diane never said anything openly negative. She was too careful for that. What she did was ask questions. Small, seemingly innocent questions, posed to Robert in the quiet of their bedroom after the house had gone dark. Questions about whether Sarah seemed happy to him, whether she seemed settled, whether it worried him, the way she spent so much time alone, whether he thought she was struggling to adjust. She planted seeds of worry that she then gently, regularly watered, until Robert began to see his daughter not as a young woman who was doing the difficult and private work of figuring out her own life, but as a problem in need of a solution. He did not know he was being managed. He would not have believed it if someone had told him. He believed that his concerns about Sarah were his own. He did not notice that every concern he had could be traced back to a conversation with Diane. Diane also worked on Sarah directly, in the way she worked on everything, which was without leaving fingerprints. She organized family activities that Sarah was technically invited to, but that were structured around Marcus and Leah's interests in ways that made Sarah peripheral. She redecorated the living room, and then the kitchen, in a style that was entirely her own, erasing the last traces of Ellen's choices from the house one room at a time. She put away the framed photographs of Robert and Ellen that had been on the mantelpiece, explaining to Robert that it might be healthy for all of them to focus on the present rather than the past. Robert agreed, because he always agreed, because agreeing with Diane had become a habit as comfortable and automatic as breathing. Sarah came home one afternoon and walked into the living room and stood in front of the empty mantelpiece and understood something very clearly. This was no longer her mother's house. This was no longer her house. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what to do next. She thought about the graduate program she had applied to in Nashville. She thought about the deferral she had been granted. She thought about the morning she had told her father about her acceptance and how he had said that was wonderful, honey, and then turned back to the television. She thought about a lot of things that evening. And then she heard Diane's voice downstairs, warm and easy and entirely at home, and she understood that thinking was not going to be enough. She needed to move. She had been in the process of arranging that move when Diane moved first. Sarah had saved money. She had worked extra shifts at the library and had been careful with everything she spent and had built up enough to cover first and last month's rent on an apartment in Nashville and to live simply while she started the program. She had a date in her head, 6 weeks away. She had not told her father yet because she had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment never seemed to come. And then one Tuesday evening, she walked into the kitchen to find her father sitting at the table with Diane beside him and a look on his face that she had learned over years to read accurately. It was the look of a man who has already made a decision and is now waiting for the conversation that confirms it. Diane folded her hands on the table and began to talk about a man named Nathan Cole. The way Diane presented it was masterful, and Sarah, sitting across the table listening, had to give her that much in the private accounting she was doing in her head while her face stayed carefully neutral. Diane described it as an opportunity, a family connection, distant and informal, that had come to her attention through a mutual acquaintance. A man who was looking for a partner, steady and sincere, someone grounded and genuine. A good man, she said, from a good background. She mentioned that his family and Robert's family had had passing connections years ago, which was true enough to be unverifiable. She said that Nathan had expressed interest when the introduction was floated, and that Robert thought it was worth a conversation, at least. She used the word conversation 3 times, as if this were simply a suggestion, as if Sarah had every choice in the world. And then she stopped talking and looked at Sarah with those level, measuring eyes, and the kitchen was very quiet, and Robert looked at the table, and Sarah understood that the conversation had already happened without her. The decision had already been made. The only question left was how Sarah would respond to it. She asked her father directly. She looked at Robert Carter, who had held her hand at her mother's funeral and who had once, a long time ago, known every single one of her favorite books by name. And she said to him, "Do you want me to leave?" And he looked at his hands. He looked at the table. And then he looked at Diane. Just for a moment. Just a flicker. But Sarah saw it. And that flicker told her everything. He was not going to fight for her. He was going to let this happen because letting things happen was easier than examining why they were happening and who was making them happen and what it said about him that he was letting them. She stood up from the table. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She said she needed to think about it. And she walked to her room and closed the door and sat down at her desk and took out a notebook, the one she had been keeping since her mother died, and she opened it to a clean page. She did not write anything yet. She just looked at the blank page. And she made herself a promise. Whatever happened next, she was not going to disappear. She was not going to let them reduce her. She was going to walk through whatever door was being opened, and she was going to come out the other side still herself. She did not know then how much she was going to have to trust that promise. She picked up her pen. She wrote the date. And she waited to find out. To understand Nathan Cole, you have to understand what it means to build something extraordinary and then choose to hide it. Not because you are ashamed of it. Not because it failed, but because the last time you let people see it, they took pieces of it that you could not get back. Nathan was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, the only child of James and Patricia Cole. His father ran a small accounting firm. His mother taught high school mathematics. They were not wealthy people, but they were exact and careful, and they had a particular quality that Nathan absorbed entirely, which was that they paid close attention to how things actually worked. Not how people said they worked, how they actually worked. That quality, applied to finance, made Nathan Cole a millionaire before he was 25 and a billionaire by 30. It sounds simple when you say it that way. It was not simple. It was 10 years of relentless focus and a kind of discipline that most people are not built for. The discipline of sitting with complexity long enough to understand it when everyone else has moved on to the next thing. The Cole Group started as a single investment. Nathan was 23 and working at a regional bank and had saved $11,000, which was every dollar he had, and he put it into a distressed commercial property in East Knoxville that everyone else thought was a bad idea. He had done the math. He had read the city planning documents. He had walked the neighborhood at different times of day and talked to the people who lived there and paid attention in ways that spreadsheets cannot capture. The investment returned 400% in 18 months. He put all of it back in. He found two partners who trusted his judgment and brought capital he could not access alone. And then he found another property, and another. And then he moved into business acquisitions, and then into private equity. And by the time he was 28, the Cole Group was managing over $4 billion in assets, and his name was appearing in the kind of financial publications that are read by people who move money in significant quantities. He was, by every measure, a success story. He was on panels. He was photographed. He was the kind of person that business schools asked to come and speak to their students. He was visible in the way that successful people in his world were expected to be visible. And then Victoria came into his life, and everything changed. Her full name was Victoria Marlowe. She came into his life at an industry conference in Atlanta, introduced by a colleague as a consultant who worked with several firms in his space. She was brilliant in the way that people who are genuinely dangerous are often brilliant, effortlessly, naturally, with the kind of intelligence that moves fast enough to stay one step ahead of the questions you should be asking. She was also beautiful and funny and entirely convincing, and Nathan, who was 30 and had spent his 20s almost entirely inside the work, found himself trusting her in a way he had not trusted anyone in years. They were together for 18 months. He was careful about what he shared, or he thought he was. He shared enough. He shared things about deals in progress, about partnerships being considered, about the internal workings of the Cole Group, not deliberately, not in the transactional way of a person feeding intelligence to a competitor, but in the natural way of a man who has let someone past his guard and does not yet understand what that means. He found out on a Monday morning in February. His lead counsel called before he had finished his first coffee of the day and told him, in the careful voice of a lawyer delivering news that cannot be softened, that two of the Cole Group's most significant pending contracts had collapsed overnight. that a financial publication had just run a piece containing information that could only have come from inside the firm, that 2 board members were calling for an emergency meeting. He sat with the phone in his hand after the call ended and went through everything very quickly and very clearly, the way his mind worked when the stakes were high, and he understood exactly what had happened and who had made it happen. He was not wrong. The investigation that followed confirmed it. Victoria had been working for a competing firm, not as an employee but as a contractor retained specifically for the purpose of getting close to Nathan and gathering whatever she could. She had been paid well for it. She had done her job thoroughly, and Nathan Cole had paid the price. The litigation took 2 years. He won, in the technical legal sense of that word, which meant he recovered some damages, and the competing firm faced regulatory scrutiny, and the people most directly involved faced professional consequences. But winning in court does not give you back the partnerships that dissolved, or the reputation that was damaged, or the particular feeling of having trusted someone completely and being precisely wrong about them. Nathan came out of the litigation changed. Not bitter exactly. He was too precise for bitterness, which requires a certain messiness of emotion that his nature did not really allow for. What he came out with was a decision. He restructured the Cole Group entirely. He moved it behind a series of holding companies. He stepped back from all public-facing activity. He sold his apartment in the upscale part of Knoxville and moved into a modest place on the 4th floor of an ordinary building. He sold the cars. He stopped going to conferences. He rebuilt the firm from behind a wall of anonymity that was carefully designed to be invisible from the outside. Anyone looking at Nathan Cole's life from the outside would have seen a quiet, unremarkable man in his mid-30s who seemed to be doing fine, but nothing more. That was the point. That was exactly the point. He agreed to the arrangement with Sarah because of a man named Harold Greer. Harold was 72 years old and had known Nathan's father since they were boys together. And when the arrangement was floated, Harold had come to Nathan personally and said that he had met Sarah Carter once, briefly, at a library fundraiser in town, and that she was the kind of person you remembered afterward, not for anything showy or performed, but for the specific quality of her attention. He said she was the kind of person who listened like she meant it. Nathan sat with that description for 8 days. He had not been looking for anything. He had specifically stopped looking. But there was something in Harold's description of a woman who listened like she meant it that reached past the wall Nathan had built and touched something he had not been in contact with for a long time. He said yes, not to love, not to the future, just to the possibility of something quieter than the life he had been living alone. He drove to meet Robert Carter and shook his hand and looked at the framed photograph of Ellen Carter on the wall and thought about his own parents, both gone, and about how quickly a life can change shape without your permission. He went home and took a long time going to sleep. The next time he saw Sarah Carter was at their wedding. The morning of the wedding, Sarah woke up at 5:47 and lay in the dark of her childhood bedroom looking at the ceiling for a long time. She had not slept well. She had been awake since 3, the way you are awake in the deep part of the night when your mind is moving too fast for sleep to catch up with it, thinking about her mother and about Nashville and about the graduate program she had deferred again and about the promise she had made herself at the desk with the blank notebook page, the promise to stay herself no matter what came next. She thought about what staying herself was going to require of her today. She thought it was probably going to require quite a lot. She got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table alone in the quiet before the house woke up. And she thought about her mother, who had sat at this same table every morning and held her coffee in both hands the way Sarah was holding hers now. And she thought about what Ellen would have said to her this morning. She thought Ellen would have said, "Stay open." It was the hardest thing she had ever been asked to do. She stayed open. The ceremony was held at a small event space attached to a church in town that neither of them attended. The room held maybe 40 people, most of them Diane's connections, people who had come because they had been invited and who understood enough of the social architecture of the occasion to dress appropriately and say the right things, but who had no deep investment in what was happening. Carla Williams, Sarah's best friend since the 9th grade, drove up from Nashville on 2 days' notice and sat 3 rows back with her handbag clutched in her lap and her eyes moving carefully around the room, taking in everything, understanding more than Sarah had told her and less than the full truth of it, which was still more than almost anyone else in the room. Robert Carter sat in the front row in the charcoal suit he wore to every formal occasion and looked at the floor with the focused attention of a man who has decided not to examine his own choices too closely today. Diane sat beside him in deep burgundy, composed and elegant, speaking quietly to Leah beside her, entirely in control of herself and the room. Nathan arrived at 7 minutes to an hour. He came through the side entrance with the quiet efficiency of a man who plans the practical details of things without drawing attention to the planning. He wore a dark navy suit that fit him well without announcing itself. He stood at the front of the room and waited, and Sarah, watching him from the anteroom where she was standing with the bouquet she had not chosen, thought about what Harold Greer had said about him, and tried to reconcile it with the man standing 40 feet away who was looking at a point just above the heads of the assembled guests with the absolute stillness of someone who has taught himself not to show what he is feeling. She could not read him at all. That was the first thing she noticed. After a lifetime of being surrounded by people whose feelings were legible, whose moods shaped the atmosphere of every room she entered, here was a man who gave nothing away. She found that, in a way she could not entirely explain, something close to restful. They met at the altar, and she looked at him, and he looked at her. Not the way you look at someone you have been waiting for. Not with longing or recognition or any of the things that love stories put in this moment. He looked at her the way someone looks at a situation they are taking seriously, with full attention and no performance. She looked back the same way, and something passed between them in that exchange that neither of them could have named yet. Something that was not warm exactly but was not cold either. Something that belonged to a category of feeling that does not have a common word. The feeling of two people recognizing, in the same instant, that they are both in a situation they did not fully choose and that neither of them is going to pretend otherwise. The officiant spoke the words. Nathan said "I do" in a clear, even voice. Sarah said it too, quietly, and her voice was not quite steady, and Carla 3 rows back pressed her lips together and held her handbag tighter. Diane cried at the appropriate moment, with the control of a woman who cries when it will be seen and not a moment before or after. The reception lasted 2 hours. Nathan moved through it with the efficiency of a man completing a task he had agreed to complete. He was polite to everyone who spoke to him. He answered questions without volunteering information. He shook Robert Carter's hand and said the correct things and looked at Diane with a courtesy so neutral it contained nothing she could respond to. Sarah moved through the reception on a different kind of autopilot, the kind that looks like composure from the outside and feels like holding your breath from the inside. Carla found her by the drinks table and took her hand for a moment and looked at her and said nothing, which was exactly right, which was why Carla had been her best friend for 12 years. At one point, Sarah and Nathan were standing beside each other at the drinks table, the brief coincidence of two people arriving at the same place at the same time, and the silence between them lasted long enough to become deliberate. And then he reached past her and picked up 2 glasses and set one in front of her. Not champagne. Water. Because he had noticed, at some point in the preceding 2 hours, that she had not been drinking. She looked at the glass of water, and then she looked at him. He looked back at her without expression. She picked up the glass. They both looked away. And in the car on the way out of town, sitting in the back seat with her hands in her lap and her wedding dress pressed against the window, Sarah thought about that glass of water and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the strange suspended quality of the whole day, a small, precise flicker of something she could not yet name. The house he had arranged for them was in a neighborhood outside Knoxville where the streets had trees old enough to arch over the road, and the houses sat back from the sidewalk with yards that had been kept without being manicured. It was a 4-bedroom house with a porch that ran the length of the front and a kitchen window that caught the morning light, and a backyard with a maple tree that would have been exactly right for a tire swing. He had been in the house for a week before she arrived. He had furnished it carefully and simply, without excess, in the way of someone who thinks about utility and proportion. The floors were clean. The kitchen was stocked. There was soap by every sink and clean towels folded in every bathroom and a shelf of books in the room that was hers. Not full but not empty. A shelf that held 6 books he had selected and arranged with a space clearly left for more. She stood in the doorway of that room on the evening she arrived and looked at that shelf for a long moment. 6 books. Not random. 2 were novels she had mentioned in the brief, formal conversation they had had on the phone the week before the wedding, mentioned in passing, not as favorites exactly, just as books she had read recently that had stayed with her. He had heard that. He had filed it. He had put them on the shelf. She did not say anything about it. But she understood, standing in that doorway with her single suitcase beside her, that something had been communicated to her that she needed to think about carefully. The first evening they ate dinner at the kitchen table and talked about practical things. Morning schedules, whether she planned to work, grocery preferences, what the neighborhood was like. He answered her questions directly and without elaboration, which she found clear and not unfriendly. He asked her one question that was not practical. He asked if there was anything she needed. Not anything she needed from the house, or anything she needed for dinner, but anything, left open. The kind of question that can be answered practically or honestly, depending on what the person asking is actually offering. She said no, not because there was nothing she needed, but because she was not yet ready to answer that question honestly with this man she did not know. He nodded. They finished dinner. She made tea and he sat with a glass of water, and they sat in the kitchen for a while longer without talking, a silence that had the quality, she thought later, of two people taking the measure of each other without either of them being quite ready to say what they were finding. She went to bed at 10 and lay in the room with the books on the shelf and listened to the house settle into its nighttime sounds and thought, before she fell asleep, that whatever this was, it was not what she had been afraid of. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, something worth paying attention to. She found the county library branch on her third morning in the neighborhood. It was 3 miles from the house, a 15-minute walk if she went the long way along the path by the creek, which she preferred. She went in and introduced herself to the branch librarian, a woman named Gloria who had been running that branch for 22 years and had the specific competence and ease of someone who has spent decades doing exactly the right thing in exactly the right place. Gloria put her to work that same morning, not in a formal employment sense, not at first, but in the way that libraries have always absorbed people who need them, quietly and practically, and without making a fuss about it. Sarah shelved books and helped with the children's reading hour on Thursday afternoons and cataloged a backlog of donated titles that had been sitting in the storage room since the previous spring. She came in 3 mornings a week and sometimes 4. It was not the graduate program in Nashville. It was not the life she had been building before. But it was something real and it was hers, and it gave shape to her days in a way that the house alone, however clean and well-stocked, could not. In the evenings Nathan came home at different times depending on whatever it was he was doing during the days, and they would eat dinner together and talk with the careful, gradual quality of two people who were learning the territory of each other. She noticed things about him in those early weeks. He did not fill silences compulsively the way people who are uncomfortable with themselves often do. He listened to what she actually said rather than preparing his response while she was still talking. He read, every evening, for at least an hour, and the books he read were not professional texts but novels and history and philosophy, arranged that told her something about the breadth of how his mind worked. He was not warm in the way her mother had been warm, that natural, radiating quality of a person who is simply built that way. But he was something that she found, after a while, more valuable in its own way. He was consistently present. He was there when he said he would be there. He did what he said he would do. In the vocabulary of trust, which Sarah had been building carefully since she was 17 and had learned not to rely on it casually, that was not nothing. That was quite a lot. She found the folder on the 11th day. She had been looking for a pen. She had looked in the kitchen junk drawer first, which had pens, but none that worked, and then she had tried the drawer by the phone, and then she had pulled open the third drawer in the kitchen island, which was tighter than the others and required a little force, and which she had not opened before. The folder was at the back, slipped between the drawer divider and the side of the cabinet in a way that suggested it had been there a while, possibly forgotten, possibly not. She almost pushed it back. There was a fraction of a second where she might have. She did not. She pulled it out. She set it on the counter. And she opened it. She sat at the kitchen table, the table where they had been having dinner together for 11 days. And she put the folder down and looked at it and thought. She was not thinking about what the money meant in the practical terms of her life going forward. She was thinking about the bookshelf, about the water instead of champagne, about the way he listened when she talked, that specific quality of attention she had noticed and cataloged without fully understanding why it mattered to her. She was thinking about a man who had this, all of this, who had built something of this size and this significance, and who had chosen to live in a modest apartment and drive an ordinary truck and drink gas station coffee. She was thinking about why, and she was thinking, with the honest precision that had been her mother's gift to her, and that she had never been able to turn off even when she wanted to. That the why was probably not a simple story. That was probably a story about loss. About what happens when you trust the wrong person with something you have built. She had not been told that story yet, but she could feel the shape of it from where she was sitting. She put the folder back in the drawer. She went to her room, and she sat with what she had found for 2 days before she said anything. He knew she had found it before she told him. He noticed the change in the way she carried herself at dinner on the 12th and 13th evenings, a slight shift in the quality of her attention toward him, a new layer of something in the way she looked at him that was not calculation. He was certain of that. He had seen calculation, and this was not it. It was closer to the look of a person who is reassessing something. Not what they can get from a situation, but what the situation actually is. He waited. He gave her the space she was using to think. On the 14th morning, he came downstairs and found her already in the kitchen with 2 cups of tea made, his on the counter where he usually stood, and he understood that she was ready. He picked up the cup. She said, "I found the folder." He said, "I know." She asked why he had not told her. He said, "Because the last time someone knew about the money before they knew me, it cost me more than I have words for at a kitchen table." She looked at him for a long moment. And then she said, "That is fair. That is the most honest thing I have heard from anyone in a long time." And the conversation that followed was not long or dramatic. It was 2 people being honest with each other about the things that had shaped them. And it was, without either of them announcing it as such, the moment that everything actually began. The weeks after the conversation about the folder had a different quality to them. Not dramatically different. Not suddenly warm and easy in the way of a romantic movie. But different in the way that a room feels different when a window has been opened, when something that had been still begins, very gently, to move. Nathan started coming home a little earlier. Not every day, but often enough that Sarah noticed the pattern and understood it as deliberate. She started leaving books on the kitchen table in the evenings, open to whatever page she was on, and one night she looked up from the page she was reading, and he had picked up the book and was reading the page before hers, and she watched him for a moment, and then went back to her own page, and they read in the same room together in that comfortable quiet for the better part of an hour. It happened again the following evening, and the evening after that. They started talking about what they were reading, carefully at first, and then with more range, and the conversations would start on one topic and move through 3 or 4 others before they noticed how much time had passed, and Sarah would look up at the clock and find that it was after midnight, and she had completely forgotten to be careful. He told her about his parents. About his father sitting at the kitchen table every Sunday morning with the financial section of the newspaper, running a penciled-down columns of numbers with the focused enjoyment of a man doing something he was genuinely good at. About his mother explaining quadratic equations at the blackboard in a way that made the students in the back row put down their phones. About the specific grief of losing them both before the Cole Group became what it became, before he could show them what he had built from the habits they had given him. He told her about Victoria. Not all of it at once. He told it the way you tell something you have been carrying alone for a long time, testing the weight of each piece before you set it down, watching to see if the person receiving it can hold it. Sarah held all of it. She did not offer comfort in the reflexive way, did not rush to assure him that it was not his fault or that everything happened for a reason. She listened. She asked 2 or 3 real questions. And when he had said what he was going to say that night, she looked at him and said, "I understand why you built the walls. I just want you to know that I am not standing at them trying to find a way in. I am just sitting on my side of them being honest." He looked at her for a long time after that. And he said, "I know. I noticed." She told him about her mother. She had not talked about Ellen Carter to anyone who did not already know her in years. There was something about talking about your mother to people who never met her. She had always found that it required a particular kind of trust, because you were the only person in the room who knew whether the person listening was actually receiving what you were giving them or just nodding in the general direction of your grief. Nathan received it. He asked about the fireflies and the porch in a way that suggested he understood that this detail was not a decoration but a door into something essential. He asked what her mother would have thought about Sarah working at the library, and she said without hesitation, she would have brought a covered dish on the first day and known all the regulars by name within a week. He almost smiled. That almost smile, she thought, was one of the most carefully rationed things she had ever seen. And every time it appeared, brief and controlled and entirely real, She felt something shift in her that she did not yet have the right word for. She started working on the graduate program reinstatement in the second month. She made the calls and sent the emails and navigated the institutional language with the efficiency of someone who had spent years watching the gap between how things were supposed to work and how they actually worked, and had learned to move in the actual gap rather than the supposed one. Nathan helped when she asked. He did not volunteer solutions or position himself as the person with the answers. He simply knew, when she brought him a specific problem, exactly which lever to pull. He knew how institutional systems actually worked. He knew who to call and how to ask the question so that the answer was yes. He was useful in the specific, focused way of a man who respects other people's competence and adds to it rather than replacing it. She found that, in practice, enormously attractive. Not in the surface way, in the deep way, the way that builds over time rather than burning fast and leaving nothing. Diane called for the first time 6 weeks into the marriage. Sarah was shelving returns at the library when the phone buzzed in her pocket, and she looked at the screen and felt the particular feeling that Diane's name had always produced in her, a slight tightening, a preparation, the instinctive composure of someone putting on armor before they knew they needed it. She let it go to voicemail. She finished her shift. She sat in the library parking lot in the early afternoon light and listened to the message twice. Diane's voice was warm and easy, asking how Sarah was settling in, mentioning that Robert had been asking about her, noting in a light and almost casual way that adjusting to a new life with a new person in a new place must be quite a lot to manage. The subtext was as clear as the voice itself. Diane wanted to know if Sarah was unhappy. She wanted to hear the evidence of a plan working. Sarah sat with the phone in her lap for a moment. Then she drove home and made dinner, and when Nathan came in she told him that Diane had called. He set his keys on the counter. He said, "What did she want?" She said she wanted to know if I was suffering. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And are you?" Sarah thought about the bookshelf. She thought about the water glass. She thought about conversations that went past midnight and a man who listened like he meant it, and an almost smile that she had started to look forward to. She said no. He nodded. They ate dinner. She called Diane back the following day. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Sarah kept her voice at the precise temperature of pleasant neutrality, the register she had spent years perfecting in that house on Maple Creek Road. She said the house was comfortable. She said the neighborhood was quiet and she liked it. She said she had been spending time at the library. She said Nathan was kind. She did not say more than that. She did not need to. Diane had called hoping to hear a particular note in Sarah's voice, the sound of a person holding themselves together with effort, and that note was not there. What was there was steadiness, calm, a woman who sounded genuinely not where Diane had put her. Diane kept her voice warm for the rest of the call. She said it was so good to hear Sarah sound well. She hung up, and she sat in the living room of the house on Maple Creek Road for a while after the call ended, thinking about the quality of Sarah's voice and what it meant and what she might have missed. She arrived unannounced on a Thursday in the third month. She had driven 3 hours with a covered dish and a bright, arranged smile, and she stood on the porch and knocked in the particular way Diane always knocked, 3 times with authority, the knock of a person who does not expect to have to knock twice. Sarah opened the door. She took in the covered dish and the burgundy coat and the smile and felt, in her body before she had time to process it in her mind, the same sensation she had always felt in Diane's presence. The sensation of being evaluated, of being measured against a standard she had not agreed to. She stepped back from the door and said, "Please come in." She gave Diane the tour that the situation required. The living room, the kitchen, the study, the backyard where the maple tree was beginning to show its spring leaves. She watched Diane move through each room with those measuring eyes, looking for the evidence of the failure she had designed. She found instead a house that was clean and lived in, books on every available surface, a kitchen that smelled like the morning's coffee, 2 chairs at the kitchen table pulled slightly toward each other, the way furniture moves when people use it comfortably, and between those chairs a book with 2 bookmarks in it. Diane stood in the kitchen and looked at those 2 chairs for a moment that lasted just a beat too long. And then she turned to Sarah with her composed smile and said, "You seem settled." And Sarah Carter, who had been told by this woman's presence and her silences and her careful campaign for years that she did not belong anywhere, looked back at her and said, "I am." He left her a letter on her pillow on the night of their 4-month anniversary, which was not an occasion he had marked or announced. She found it when she came upstairs after finishing the chapter she had been reading in the kitchen. It was written by hand on a single sheet of paper in his precise, even handwriting, and it was not long, and it was not romantic in the conventional sense of that word. It did not use the language of love stories. It used the language of a man who thinks carefully before he speaks and has thought very carefully before he puts pen to paper. He wrote about trust, about what it had meant to him, in the years since Victoria, to have built a life from which he had removed trust deliberately because the alternative was to be broken by its absence. He wrote about noticing things, about the specific quality of Sarah's attention toward everything she considered important. He wrote that he had not expected, when he said yes to this arrangement, to find someone who made the silence feel like something worth having. He did not use the word love. He was not ready for that word yet. But what he had written was, in every way that mattered, the shape of it. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed and read it twice. And then she sat down and opened the notebook on the nightstand, and she added 3 pages in one sitting. She wrote about walls coming down, about the specific terror and relief of finding yourself no longer performing safety, but actually feeling it, about what it meant to be seen clearly by someone who had no reason to see you kindly and chose to anyway. Nathan said, "I love you" on a Wednesday evening in November. They had been to a bookshop on the edge of town and had spent far longer there than either of them had planned, pulled from one section to another by the specific gravity of things worth reading. It was dark and cold when they came out, and Sarah was wearing his coat over her own jacket because she had underestimated the weather in the way she often did, and they were walking home talking about something ordinary, and he stopped walking. She stopped too. She turned to look at him. He said it. 3 words, standing alone in the cold night air, without setup or qualification or the careful framing he gave to everything else he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "I know. I have been trying to figure out what to do about that for a while." He said, "Have you figured it out?" She reached over and took his hand, and they stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold and the quiet, and then walked home together. And that night, she added one final line to the letter she had been writing for 4 months. She wrote, "I stopped walking away and started walking toward. And what I was walking toward was you." She put the letter in an envelope the following Friday evening. She wrote his name on the front. She placed it on his pillow. She went downstairs and made tea and sat at the kitchen table and waited. She heard him come upstairs. She heard the silence that settled over the house while he read it, the particular silence of Nathan Cole at a moment that had gotten past the walls. Then she heard him come back downstairs. He came into the kitchen with the letter in his hand. He set it on the table between them. He looked at her for a long time. And then he said, "I have been trying to write you a letter for 4 months." She said, "I know. I found 3 drafts in the recycling." He said they were not good enough. She said, "This one was." He picked up the letter and held it. And they sat in the kitchen that had been the site of hundreds of dinners and hundreds of conversations, and the slow, careful building of a life that neither of them had planned. And outside the window the November night was cold and full of stars. And neither of them needed to say anything else. Some things are too complete for words. This was one of them. Diane found out about the Cole Group in the spring of the following year. She found out the way people almost always find out things that were not meant for them, which is through someone else's careless excitement at a social gathering. A woman in Diane's circle had attended a charity event in Nashville and had seen Nathan there, introduced to the room in his actual capacity as the founder and principal of the Cole Group, whose contribution to a children's hospital fund was substantial enough to warrant a specific mention. The woman had come home and searched his name and found enough to understand that she had been standing in the same room as a man whose operations were worth considerably more than anything she had previously imagined, and she had called Diane the same evening. Diane sat on the couch with a glass of wine she had poured before the call and listened to everything the woman told her. She did not say much. She thanked her. She hung up. She sat with the glass of wine for a long time without drinking it, going back through the past year in her mind, going back through the arrangement and the man she had selected and the reasons she had selected him and the very specific confidence she had felt in that driveway watching the car pull away. She had chosen Nathan Cole because he seemed like nothing. She had been so thoroughly, so precisely, so completely wrong. She called Sarah that night. This call was different from all the previous ones. The warmth was present but under strain, and Sarah, who had been listening to Diane's voice her entire adult life and knew every frequency of it, heard the strain immediately. Diane asked, with a directness she did not usually permit herself, whether Nathan was who people were describing. Sarah was in the living room when the call came. She looked across at Nathan at the desk in the study, the lamp warm against the dark of the November night outside. She stepped into the hallway and said yes. She said she had known for a while. The silence on the other end of the line was different from Diane's usual silences. Her usual silences were controlled, deployed. This one was genuine. This one was a woman encountering an outcome she had not prepared for. And then Diane said, in the careful voice of a person attempting to recover her footing, that she had always had Sarah's best interests at heart. Sarah let that sit in the air for a moment. Then she said, Diane, I know exactly what you had at heart, and I want you to know something. I am happy. Not because of his money, I want you to hear that clearly. I am happy because of who he is, which is something you never thought to look for, because you were not looking for someone for me. You were looking for a way to remove me. You just happened to choose someone worth finding. And then she said good night, and she went back to the living room and sat down across from Nathan and picked up her tea. He looked up from the desk. She looked at him. She said Diane called. He said, how was she? Sarah thought about it for a moment. She said, surprised. He said, good. And she smiled. And it was the smile of a woman who is entirely, completely, unmistakably exactly where she is supposed to be. Robert Carter called Sarah on their first wedding anniversary. He called in the morning, early, before the day had organized itself, which was unlike him, which told her something. His voice was the voice of a man who had been rehearsing what he was going to say and had decided at the last minute to set the rehearsal aside and just say the real thing. He said, I let you down. Just that. No context. No explanation. No qualifications around it. I let you down. Sarah sat with the phone against her ear and the morning light coming through the kitchen window and thought about what to say. She could have said it was fine. She could have let him off easily, the way she had been letting people off easily her whole life, because it was simpler than asking them to carry the weight of what they had actually done. She did not do that this time. She said yes. And then, after a pause, she said, come visit sometime. He said, after a longer pause, that he would. She believed him, not because she was certain he would follow through, but because there was something in his voice she had not heard from him in a very long time. Something that sounded like the particular exhaustion of a man who has stopped pretending. She left the door open. She went back to her kitchen and made coffee for two and waited for Nathan to come downstairs. He did visit. 2 months later, he drove up on a Saturday and sat at the kitchen table where Sarah and Nathan ate their dinners, and he stayed for the afternoon and into the evening. Sarah made the chicken soup that her mother had made every time anyone in the house was recovering from anything, which felt right in a way she did not need to explain. Nathan sat with Robert at the table, and they talked about the kinds of things men who are finding their footing with each other talk about, careful and genuine in equal measure. Robert was quieter than Sarah remembered him being. He looked older. He looked like a man who had been doing some hard internal accounting. At one point, Sarah came back from the kitchen and found her father looking at the bookshelves in the living room. All the books she had brought and all the ones she had acquired since, and Nathan's books mixed in between them, and the space of the room that was clearly a shared space, clearly a life being actively lived in. Robert stood there looking at it for a moment, and then he turned around and he looked at his daughter, and something passed across his face that she recognized as a man seeing what he almost gave away. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She went over to him, and he put his arms around her in the way he had when she was small, before grief had put a wall between them, and she let him. And outside the window the January afternoon was gray and cold and entirely ordinary, and inside the house it was warm. There is a version of this story that ends badly. There is a version where two people are placed in each other's lives by someone else's selfishness, and where the walls they have each built, carefully, and for good reason, hold. Where Nathan Cole's discipline keeps him behind the life he constructed, and Sarah Carter's hard-won self-sufficiency keeps her from reaching toward anything she has not fully tested. That version is entirely believable. That version is probably what most people who knew them would have predicted. What stopped it from being that version was not luck, although luck had a small part in it. What turned it into this story was something quieter and more deliberate than luck. It was the small choices they each made, beginning from the very first evening in that house outside Knoxville, to show up honestly. To pay attention. To be present in the full sense of that word. Not just physically present, but genuinely there. Noticing the other person, responding to what was actually being offered rather than to what was expected or feared. Those choices were not always easy. There were evenings where keeping walls up must have been tempting. They made the choice anyway. Every day, quietly, without announcing it. That is what love actually looks like, most of the time. Not the moment of declaration. The daily, undramatic choice. Diane's plan was built on a particular belief about Sarah Carter. The belief that Sarah was, in the final accounting, movable. That she was the kind of person who could be relocated without consequence, who could be redirected and diminished, and slowly convinced that what was being done to her was reasonable. That belief was the fundamental error at the center of everything Diane did. Because Sarah Carter was not movable, she was patient, which is different. She was willing to wait, to observe, to understand a situation before she responded to it. But she was not movable. She carried her mother's warmth and her mother's attention to the beautiful things and the promise she had made at 14 years old to stay open even when it was hard. And those things are not movable. They go where the person goes. They survive what is done to the person. They are, in the end, the person. And Nathan Cole, who had spent 6 years choosing invisibility because being seen had cost him too much, found in Sarah Carter someone whose way of seeing him was different from anything he had encountered before. She did not see what he had built. She saw how he had built it, and why, and what it had cost. She saw the man. That is rarer than most people understand. And it is, in the end, what all of us are hoping someone will do. What happened to Diane in the aftermath is not a story of dramatic consequences. There was no public reckoning. That is the honest part. Life does not usually work like that. What happened to Diane was quieter and harder than public consequences. What happened was that she had to go on living in the house on Maple Creek Road with Robert Carter, who had been changing since the anniversary phone call, who had been doing the hard and private work of understanding what had happened and what his part in it had been, and who was no longer the man who looked at the table when his daughter asked him a direct question. He was becoming, slowly and imperfectly, the man who answered. And Diane, who had built her position on a particular version of Robert, on a man who needed to be managed and shielded from the things he did not want to see, found herself living with a different version. A version who was paying attention. That is, for a person whose whole strategy depends on the people around them not looking too closely, a very great deal. But here is the thing. Here is the thing we have been holding back, not to deceive you, but because it belongs here, at the end, where its weight can be felt properly. There is a reason Diane moved as quickly as she did. There is a reason that the arrangement was not just about making room in the house for her children, not just about removing a reminder of Ellen Carter from the mantelpiece and the kitchen and the general atmosphere of the life she had taken over. There was a more specific reason. A reason that had to do with something Diane had been keeping from Robert Carter since before the wedding. A financial matter, which is to say, in the language of the situation, a secret. And Sarah, in the months she had spent in that house being overlooked and managed and carefully made peripheral, had come, without fully understanding what she was seeing, very close to it. She had found a document in a filing cabinet she was not supposed to open, looking for a stamp. She had seen numbers that did not match the account she knew about. She had not understood it yet, but she had been close. And Diane had known she was close. And that was when the arrangement with Nathan Cole had stopped being a long-term strategy and become an urgent one. The full story of what Diane had been keeping from Robert Carter is the next episode of this series. And it is one you absolutely cannot miss. Because what Sarah eventually found out, and what Nathan did with what she found, and what it meant for the house on Maple Creek Road, and for a marriage that had been built on a foundation that neither party had been able to see clearly, is a story about truth and what it costs and what it frees. It is a story about what happens when the secrets people keep to protect their position finally come out into the light. And it is, in many ways, the most important part of everything we have told you tonight. What Sarah and Nathan built together is real, and it is extraordinary, and it is the part of this story that will stay with you. But what they discovered together about Diane, and about the life Robert Carter had been living without knowing what was underneath it, is the part that changes everything. Stay with us. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Because the next chapter is coming, and it will make everything you heard tonight land differently. Before we go, we want to ask you something genuinely. If you were Sarah Carter, sitting in the back of that car on the morning of your wedding, being driven away from the only home you had ever known toward a life you had not chosen. What would you have done? Would you have let yourself open up the way she did? Would you have trusted what was slowly, carefully, honestly being offered to you? Or would you have kept every wall standing and survived the situation without letting it change you? Tell us in the comments. We read them, all of them, and tell us where you are watching from, because we love knowing where these stories find people. Across the United States, across the world, in living rooms and kitchens and cars and libraries. Wherever you are tonight, we are glad you found this story. We are glad you stayed for all of it. If this story moved you, if you heard something in it that felt true about your own life or the life of someone you love, please share this video. These stories deserve to find the people who need them, and the people who need them deserve to find them. Hit the like button, leave a comment, subscribe to Letters Never Sent. Every single week, we open the letters that people were never brave enough to send. We tell the stories underneath the stories, the ones that live in the silence between what was said and what was meant, between what was done and what was felt, between who people were told to be and who they actually became. We will see you in the next one. And the next one, we promise you, is one you will not forget.